Good evening, all. At the outset, we would like to thank you all for your gracious presence at this academic feast. On behalf of Zydus, Ms. Nanda Zuwatkar, Business Unit Head, and I, Sachin Lohar, take great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to an encounter with experts, a panel discussion based on experience and evidence. Zydus has always been on the forefront of disseminating meaningful science, and having organized today's event, a web-based symposium on H. pylori, a never-ending case, confirms the fact further. You will agree that despite all advancement, eradication of H. pylori infection continues to be a great challenge. Today's panel discussion aims to address the unanswered questions related to H. pylori. To answer the questions, we have expert panelists, Dr. Anil Arora, Chairman, Department of Gastroenterology and Hepatology, Sir Gangaram Hospital, Delhi. Dr. K.R. Palaniswamy, Senior Consultant Gastroenterologist, Apollo Hospital, Chennai. Dr. K.T. Shinoy, Medical Gastroenterologist, Professor and HOD, Sri Gokulam Medical College and Research Foundation, Tiruvananthapuram. Dr. Philip Abraham, Senior Gastroenterologist and Hepatologist, PD Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. Dr. Shobna Bhatia, Head Motility and Consultant Gastroenterologist, Sir H.N. Reliance Foundation Hospital and Research Foundation Center, Mumbai. Dr. V.G. Mohan Prasad, Gastroenterologist, Hepatologist, and Therapeutic Endoscopist, Founder and Chairman, VGM Gastro Center, Coimbatore. And as a moderator for the event, we have Dr. Setu Babu, Senior Consultant Medical Gastroenterologist, KIMS Hospital, Hyderabad. Without taking further time, we would like to hand over the session to Dr. Setu Babu, who has been instrumental in conceptualizing this entire event. Over to you, Dr. Setu Babu.
Okay, I hope I'm seen, and I must thank Zydus for creating such platform and welcome all wonderful fraternity members. And we thought the format is something different, where we don't show slides which binds you, or you go out of bounds of the slides and go on talking, because we really do not know. So I now start the topic with few questions, so that any one of our experts would be able to answer. And I would first request Dr. Palaniswamy to tell me one basic doubt. Whenever we do a diagnostic endoscopy, should we actually test for H. pylori for everybody in our country?
Good evening, everybody. I think the answer is routine diagnostic. When you do a diagnostic endoscopy, when you see a normal mucosa, there is no need to check for H. pylori. But on the contrary, if there is any patchy inflammation or diffuse inflammation or erosions, there sometimes you may need to take a sample. And there are standard indications where you have to probably look for the or check for the H. pylori. That is active acid peptic disease, and for past history of acid peptic disease that includes those patients who are not treated for Helicobacter pylori, early gastric cancer, maltoma, and idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, and unexplained iron deficiency anemia. And when the patient requires or planned for a long-term NSAID use, there again you have to consider checking for the H. pylori and treating. There are some controversial indications like when the long-term use of PPI, where is a controversial indication where you may or may not go check for the H. pylori, and first-degree relatives with gastric cancer also where is a controversy.
Would Professor Abraham would comment on this, because he has done a pioneering work in the beginning, and I still remember attending the first H. pylori meeting held in Mumbai, and I saw this particular bacteria creating waves those days. Professor Philip?
Muted.
Sir, the host should not mute, I told already. Nanda, will you please see that nobody is muted?
Sir, I'm not muted.
Okay, yeah. It's my fault, really. Thank you, Setu.
Yeah, right.
And you can see that it's make waves even now, because even now we are having a panel discussion on the same subject that we had 25 years ago.
True.
So, of course, I always agree with Dr. Palaniswamy. I just wanted to put it back in perspective, saying that when you're doing an endoscopy in a patient who's presenting with dyspepsia, and then you find all these all these findings, then you would do a biopsy. But if you have to broaden the question that you put, do we do it in every endoscopy that we do? The answer is obviously no. So only when there is dyspepsia and findings, or like Dr. Palaniswamy said, first degree relatives of CA stomach or multiple lymphoma. So for every endoscopy, the answer is no. But where is dyspepsia and findings on endoscopy, the answer is yes.
Do you also do in recurrent peptic ulcers, Professor Palaniswamy? Somebody comes with repeated chronic duodenal ulcer, and then you might detect and then probably is that
recurrent ulcers? We have to check for HPAL. I do check for HPAL.
Do you do, Mohan Prasad? I believe you are one of the biggest number of endoscopies. I mean, do you do RUT in every patient of yours?
Not really, but if I'm, doing a study of a dyspepsia, I would do, not otherwise. There's no indication, we don't do it.
Yeah. Do private practitioners write endoscopy plus RUT? I have seen some prescriptions like that.
I don't think in Tamil Nadu that happens, sir, but might be in Hyderabad.
Okay.
It happens. So sometimes the request come for endoscopy. Some people specifically they ask for the check for H. pylori.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it happens in Chennai as well.
Chennai also,
so,
all metros. Sir is a KT Shanai, sir.
Yeah,
I thought I will ask. Sorry, Shanai sir. Please tell me, sir.
See, I think the question which Dr. Philip mentioned, if it is a case of dyspepsia who has been endoscoped, even in the absence of having a lesion at endoscopy in the form of erythema or antral gastritis or duodenitis or an ulcer, I would say that there is an indication to H. pylori, because we have approximately 25 to 30% non-ulcer dyspepsia, and there is a high possibility of H. pylori in these individuals. So in a blanket statement that dyspepsia without any lesion at endoscopy, you can't do an H. pylori, I think may not be true. I think it all depends upon the gravity of the symptoms, but endoscopically there may not be any lesions. But there are symptoms which are referable to upper abdominal pain or discomfort with or without accompanying symptoms like nausea and vomiting. I would see that an endoscopic biopsy of the antrum for a rapid urease test or an H. pylori may be indicated.
Sir, can I add here, sir, to what statement? Absolutely true, because it depends on what type of endoscope you're using also. If your endoscopes are not the high-powered ones with magnification, so sometimes we might miss out the mucosal pattern. So the type A, type B, type C of the mucosal pattern where the capillary venous loops are seen. So if there is a, like a mosaic pattern, or if there are multiple red dots, or if there are tiny erosions with, red spots, all these are indicative of, mild atrophic changes plus sometimes intestinal metaplasia. They all three types have been associated with H. pylori, published from Japan. I think we need a higher magnification ratio. An ordinary endoscope sometimes may not be able to pick up these sort of changes. So we might think everything looks normal in our busy, quick endoscopy. We might miss some problems. So as Shanai sir put it, if there is dyspepsia, even if an endoscopist doesn't pick up anything, still it's worthwhile doing, biopsies. I think, again, it's controversial how many of them are, going to be benefited. But then the Japanese looked at it. They took the dyspepsia into two types, a H. pylori, positive dyspepsia and negative dyspepsia. Followed these guys for 6 months and 12 months and published data on this. They say that H. pylori positive dyspepsia, once you treat, about 2/3 of them, the symptoms disappear.
I think we actually got into a very real point. Whether I think this is the beautiful H. pylori. It divided people into two groups. People test and treat, or treat and test kind of concept. But there is a very important caveat in what Mohan you said. is that in a country where 50-60% of the population above the age of 40 years are positive, or you take a country like Nigeria, which is 80% positive, we are actually comparing with the European or United States, where the positivity rate is very low, and even if those positivity, they're all Asians. So should we strongly recommend do for everybody or do for suspicious ones? I think that should be the statement.
Yes. So, Setu, if I may just
Sir.
contribute to this
Yes.
discussion, because
Yes. Yes.
Dr. Shenoy has a very strong point in what he said, but the caveat or the opposite viewpoint is what you mentioned. In a country where, of course, we don't have concrete data in any of these fields, but in a country where we think that dyspeptics or the general population has a positivity of 60%, again, we don't have recent data, and then we have 60% of dyspeptics with no lesion also having H. pylori positive. Do we treat them all? Because we don't have a follow-up study from this country stating that treating all dyspeptics, what we call functional dyspepsia, with antibiotics will help them in the long term. But I will go ahead with what Dr. Shenoy said. If you look at the latest Rome 4 criteria for functional dyspepsia, their attitude is always test and treat. Before you even do an endoscopy, you can do any test and find out if it's positive and treat it. And they have actually excluded this group, H. pylori dyspepsia, from what they call functional dyspepsia, which so far we are not on solid grounds to do. But in practice, yes, dyspepsia with H. pylori positive, that is on RUT, we would probably treat, but I'm not sure that is based on solid data.
Sir, can I respond to this, sir? I have a question to ask Professor Philip. We were talking about Rome 4, and now they have functional dyspepsia is of two types. One is epigastric pain syndrome, the other one is a postprandial distress syndrome.
Yeah.
To me, for a long time, I always used to think the epigastric pain syndrome is similar to the Moynihan's disease, which we read 40 years ago.
Yes.
So, non-ulcer dyspepsia or, ulcer type of dyspepsia where you do endoscopy, you don't find an ulcer. In that case, I would expect the pain and burning on empty stomach, which reduces with food or with some cool drink or buttermilk or whatever. But now the Rome 4 says that epigastric pain syndrome unrelated to meal, the pain and burning unrelated to meal. Is that practical, sir? I'm just wondering.
If you remember the earlier Rome criteria, they had classified the same thing with an old term, ulcer-like dyspepsia and dysmotility-like dyspepsia. They've given it a new name. Yes. So I suspect that the ulcer-like dyspepsia, the ones who are more likely to respond to PPI alone, would have a higher positivity rate for H. pylori.
I'm not aware of it. But how can they say unrelated to food? The epigastric pain and burning unrelated to food?
Epigastric pain is related to food. It is the PDS that is not. Postprandial distress.
No, epigastric pain syndrome. I just found even in an article published there, it says that Rome 4 says unrelated to food, epigastric pain and burn, which is rather funny.
Yeah, I don't think we'll all
think semantic issues. I think I'll put a question to Professor Anil. We normally do a RUT and say positive, negative. Is it okay to call or would you like to suggest send it for histopathology, something like that? Anil?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Please go on.
I think, can I answer your previous question first?
You can.
The moot point which we are missing is, how many of us believe that H. pylori is a commensal or a pathogen? If 60 to 80% of the population in a poor socioeconomic country like ours has H. pylori, is it a pathogen in specific situation, or is it just a commensal which will improve with increasing socioeconomic status? That's what happens if you see between Africa and say US and the Western world. If it is just a part of poor socioeconomic status with recurrence and possibly recrudescence, is there any point of even looking for it when you do not have established things like cancer, maltoma, or peptic ulcer? And mind you, all three are pretty uncommon, especially in today's world, at least in North India. So the question of testing for it and then looking for it will depend on what is your attitude towards it, whether it is a commensal as a part of the poor socioeconomic status, or is it a pathogen in specific condition? That is number one. Rapid urease test is a very cheap, very safe, easily available, very cost-effective test for diagnosis of H. pylori, non-invasive. by endoscopic means. But probably we have to be careful and understand the caveats associated with RUT. The minimum number of positive active H. pylori which have to be present in the gastric mucosa from where you take samples has to be at least 10,000. Anything less than that will be false negative. And the recommendations are that you have to take samples not only from the antrum, but also from corpus of the stomach. As Dr. V. Mohan Prasad very rightly said, that when you're doing endoscopy in a hurry, you end up usually taking one biopsy from the antrum and then decide whether it's positive or negative. And believe me, most of our patients, by the time we do RUT, I'm talking about practical situation, they are already on PPI. The moment they are on PPI, you will have false negative results. So a combination of limited efficacy, the restricted number of the biopsies, its utility in functional dyspepsia, coupled with limited number of biopsies, it really puts a lot of caveats in putting up RUT as one of the tests for diagnosis of H. pylori, short of biopsy. The only advantage is it is pretty specific. There is only one exception and one bacteria. There is no human mammalian tissue which will produce urease. So the only organism which produces urease in mammals is human beings. There is one bacteria called Staphylococcus urealyticum which produces urease. Short of that, it is a very specific test. So it will have false negativity. But if you are doing a endoscopic for person suspected to have non-ulcer dyspepsia, primarily not to diagnose non-ulcer dyspepsia, but to look for a peptic ulcer, other complication, then if it is positive, it is pretty specific in diagnosis of H. pylori, knowing very well the caveats which I have mentioned.
Thank you, Anil. I think you passed the exam with your wonderful answer. I think when we talk about H. pylori, there are a couple of issues about the COG-A positivity, or, its pathogenicity is decided. And there is some, I read some time back in Lancet, the zymodeme pattern, particularly the enzymes which it elaborates, also matter. Dr. Philip, do you have something to say? Is it okay today in India, RUT is enough, or we send it for histopathology every patient? Because Dr. Katie Shenoy is very sensitive that we should do test and then treat as many as possible. I think we have a conflict in our statements.
Yes, we do, because let's put it this way. I mean, Anil brought up a point about most of the patients who come to us have already been on PPI. And in fact, I don't think most gastroenterologists will even wait to take off PPI for 4 weeks before they do a biopsy. I mean, that's the reality of practice. So I'm not recommending that, but most people don't. So if a patient doesn't respond to PPI and you do an endoscopy on him, and if you find a positive RUT, what do you expect to get by eradicating this organism at that time? Because we know his symptoms come from acid ultimately. And if he's not responding to PPI, if we get a positive, I know false negatives will be there, but if we get a positive, what do we hope to eradicate it? I mean, to achieve by eradicating the organism at that time. Coming back to your question about do we send all tissue for histology as well? The answer is no. Unless I'm suspecting something, I don't routinely look for gastritis unless we're looking for atrophic gastritis, gastric atrophy. In that case, because then the prognosis changes. But just finding mild inflammation on histology, in addition to the RUT telling me that HP is positive, I don't think it's going to add much to my treatment plan.
So, do you mean to say that I think Katie Shenoy has made a very important statement. The moment you find somebody a positive, you must treat them. Is that what we communicate to everyone? Dr. Shenoy?
I can.
No, I don't think that I communicated that all the people who are tested positive should be treated. But what I told is, if a person has come with a dyspepsia, as per the definition of dyspepsia, and if you are doing an endoscopy, there is no issue of not doing a biopsy. You should do a biopsy. My contention, not with relation to treatment. It is with the relation to doing a test.
So I think what Rome says also. This is what Rome says also. Test and treat if somebody comes with dyspepsia as a first line. But I don't know whether we have solid data to back that up in a country like ours, where the prevalence in the population is very high.
You should say, sir, this is an open forum. Please do it, sir. Please don't
I
even.
think one major important contentious issues in a situation like this is, if you don't want to treat, then why the hell do you test it in the first instance?
Correct.
Absolutely.
Does it have any legal implication also? And I
No, no,
agree,
no, yeah.
so many patients would be referred to you by general practitioner and physician that they primarily are looking for H. pylori. You may not do it in your own wisdom. You think there is no ulcers, you cannot see any redness, there is no frank ulceration, you don't know it. But the patient have been referred to you for H. pylori. And if you don't want to treat, then why the hell do you do it?
This is the question I have put to Palaniswamy also. Sorry, that the moment you detect, because some people refer saying endoscopy plus RUT, because all the physicians have been trained like that.
And also, I will add a situation here. Say 10 years down the line, the patient develops carcinoma. You're done an endoscopy, you did biopsy, you did not treat. Are you not liable for litigation?
Yeah, this is a far-fetched. I agree with you. But Philip has something to say.
No, I was saying the same thing. We were talking about indication for testing. So if you're not planning to treat, we certainly should not be testing at all.
Correct.
What use is that information if you're not going to treat it? So we should take a decision. Chenoy's contention also was the same. We should take a decision about, are we going to treat? If we are, then we do a test. If we are not, having that information on hand and exposing yourself to other questions later makes no sense. If you're not convinced that the H. pylori is responsible for what you see, then why test? So I agree with you, Anil, on that.
But all of us are agreeing on one point. If somebody is detected positive, he should be treated. Is that right? Anil, you had a stronger...
Yeah, you see, I have one very clear point. Here is an organism which may have, let's say, 95% sensitivity. 2 weeks of therapy, it is a potential carcinogen. It is easily detectable. Recurrence rate is very low. Tomorrow, if you have a drug which can cure it for 95% of the time, wouldn't you like to do it? It can cause peptic ulcer, it can cause ulceration, it can cause atrophy, it can cause malignancy, it can cause maltoma. And it is so easy to detect. You can just do a UBT, you can do a stool test. So the problem is that we do not have good drugs. Drugs have side effects. And our data, at least in India, is pretty minuscule in terms of our sensitivity. It is a difficult organism to grow, hence we do not have good data. So tomorrow, if we have a magic pill for 2 weeks to get rid of an infection which can cause cancer, maltoma, ulceration, it is a predisposing factor for people on long-term NSAID therapy, on those on anticoagulants, those with a family history of cancer, then why not get rid of it, especially if the reinfection rate is low. But problem is we have a very poor data of our own, and hence we have to bank upon whatever we get from the Western world or from the East Asia.
I would quote a small. I think Dr. Phillips' group actually published that the sewerage water and in Mumbai is contaminated H. pylori. So fecal-oral transmission would always be an issue even with this one. So reinfection, as you said rightly, we don't know the data, but potentially can happen. Mohan, you said something.
No, actually, time and again for the past 35 years I've been hearing India has got a high seroprevalence of H. pylori. Okay, accepted. That is because of the serological testing. And see, if you look at the IgG antibodies, I tested 100 cases way back about 25 years back for serology plus endoscopic rapid urease test and also histopathology parallel. So there was no 100% concordance naturally. But where I found concordance, where the H. pylori was positive on endoscopic biopsies, most of them had a cutoff of about 12.5. Anything above that was in the serology positivity, which showed a presence of the bacterium. This is like saying if you test all Indians, all of us will be positive for Mantoux. It is like saying we all have tuberculosis. We don't have tuberculosis. We might have been exposed to tuberculosis, so we are tested Mantoux positive. That does not mean that we have tuberculosis. So we don't have an active infection. So as you say, that many of them probably did not even look at the serological titers. They just looked at positive or negative, and then took it as 80% of our population was passed to the WHO study. The All India Institute NIAC study, all of that in the 80s did that. they took, about 1,000 children and, in Bangalore for WHO, and then Nayak studied it in Delhi, and they said 80% are positive. Even today, there have been this 2001, I just picked up the JIPMER data from Pondicherry. It says children between 5 and 15 years, 44% are positive. And this was published in 2001, 20 years ago. And then in adults, 63% positive in males and 83% positive in females. This is just serology. Just because the serological positivity is there, it does not mean there is a disease. So we need not treat all these people. And like in that case, if that is true, if you take 100 dyspepsia, 80 have to be positive. No, we are getting only 20% positivity in dyspepsia for H. pylori, which means they don't have the disease. They have come into contact with the bacterium. That's what it shows. That is how I have learned it over a period of three and a half decades.
Yeah, I think a very recent paper says detecting IgG is probably the most sensitive test compared to any one of them, but the interpretation is probably different. Now, everybody who is antibody positive may not be diseased, and they may have an infection as well with a high titers or low titers. Probably titers matter much, and we don't have much knowledge about the correlation of titers and severity of disease. But there is one area where probably Dr. Philip can comment on that, is all the upper GI bleeders have been sincerely advised that you must take anti-H. pylori therapy once the bleeding is controlled or treated. Professor Philip?
Again, I don't think we have data to back it up, but that's what we would do, because if you're talking about upper GI bleed from an ulcer, that means we're talking about a patient with an ulcer who has bled from the ulcer. Then we would treat, because doing a biopsy at the time of controlling the bleed may give us a false negative. Would we do a second endoscopy just to check for H. pylori? No. If you have non-invasive methods like urea breath test or stool antigen, you could test that and then treat. But in a patient who's got an ulcer and bleed from the ulcer, if I have any means of confirming that this patient has H. pylori, either by breath test or stool antigen, I would treat for sure. This is one indication where I would treat. Before we move on with this answer, just one more point about what Mohan Prasad mentioned about the serology. The recommendation is that the serology kit should be, constructed or devised locally, because there is even a species variation from place to place.
Genotype.
So when you have genotype, when we have serology, it should be a serology that has been developed in India, not a kit imported from abroad. So that kind of data we don't have. And if you're looking at population prevalence, like you said, we are going by ancient data, which is 3 or 4 decades, ancient data on serology, which we know is so unreliable. We don't trust that at all to decide or to determine our decision making. So what we should have is population studies of UBT or stool antigen, which practically may not happen at all. So we're falling back on second choice.
Maybe I'll ask Professor Palaniswamy to make, is there a group family history of CS stomach that we definitely do it? I mean, would be probably the first indication. Would that be a strong point? Yes. Upper GI bleed, I said we might treat, but is this another group where you test and then try to treat them?
Yes,
family.
there is a family history of a carcinoma stomach. I think probably that you have to consider screening and look for H. pylori. It's mandatory.
Was it a recommendation, Professor Philip, that HCC, HBV and all, do you really, like you get one HBV, you screen the family, you get one H. pylori, do you? I don't know, I'm not sure.
No, it makes eminent sense to do that, but there is no guideline to say that we do it. And practically, I don't think we call all the first degree family members to get their UBT or stool antigen tested in CS stomach. But if we do an endoscopy in a first degree relative, we should 100% test by RUT and or histology. So I don't know if there's any guideline that says that we should call all the members and do a UBT or stool antigen test in them.
Yeah,
there's no such recommendation, but it makes sense what Dr. Palaniswamy said.
Yeah, even though there is no guidelines, I think testing the first degree relatives of a CS stomach makes sense, and treating them, because there is a good paper in which treating and not treating. There is a New England Journal paper, and you follow them up. There is definitely a reduction of risk by treating H. pylori.
There's a recent NEJM article.
Yes, recent 2020.
Yes.
And let's not forget that all these data come from countries with higher prevalence of CS stomach.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right.
But yes, Palaniswamy, I mean, I would agree entirely with him that ideally we should guideline or no guideline.
And also, sir, this KAGE positive strains are known to be associated with carcinoma stomach. And you see this recent article published from our own Chennai city from Kilpack Medical College, the Digestive Diseases Hospital. They've said that the KAGE positivity was 59.7% in the patients that they tested. They've done, genetic genomic analysis also. They've done a phenomenal job there. And they showed that the VACA was positive in 85.5, which is as expected, but KAGE was 59.7. Even though we say that the cancer prevalence in India, carcinoma stomach is lower than the rest of the countries, probably the data may not be robust. I think we don't capture all the data like other Western countries do. Our prevalence in 2020, the cancer prevalence is 5.2. That's why they out of 100,000 cases, as compared to the Far East, which will be above 11 per 100,000. We are about 5.5. However, the West, the UK and all is 3.5. In a country like UK, where the gastric carcinoma prevalence is less than 3.5 per 100,000, even articles from there, right from Leeds onwards, many articles are there. They recommend test and treat for H. pylori. So just to prevent
Mohan,
gastric cancer.
Mohan, while your data is quite this one, there is a point which Dr. K.T. Shenoy mentioned. As the lifestyle improves or hygiene improves, there is every possibility that we are taking two paradoxical situations. The H. pylori prevalence is going to come down as our economics improve. On the other hand, the malignancy could have other factors added up, and as you said, 50% or 59% COG-A positive. There are another 50% which are COG-A negative, may not mean anything, like Anil was pointing out. Some of them are commensals, because all depends on which type of H. pylori that you have, or as Philip was saying, you need to know the particular genotype response. I think in those people who have got family history of malignancy, H. pylori will become a co-carcinogen along with the gene would be a better conclusion than saying that one alone is responsible. No. As you say, in India, probably H. pylori may not be a direct one, but it could be like HBV, a very good carcinogen. I think now I must ask all of you, could you say what regime that you follow, or can you suggest two good regimes for the listeners to say, okay, this is probably the good. Dr. Shenoy, can I ask you which regime could be an ideal one?
Well, I think if you take the evolution of treatment, which I have seen over the last 40 years, sometime in 1980s and early 90s, I was using colloidal bismuth along with other antibiotics. And then the colloidal bismuth went out of market. And currently it has come back. And we know that using the 2 antibiotics and a PPI, which is the usual triple regimen with amoxicillin, clarithromycin, and either omeprazole or pantoprazole, and there is a high chance of resistance to the extent of 20 to 25%, and people may not be able to accept the drug as they cannot tolerate. So currently, my treatment is by giving 4 drugs. I use a quadruple regimen consisting of a colloidal bismuth, 120 milligram, 2 tablets twice daily for 14 days. Omeprazole or pantoprazole, 20 milligram or 40 milligram twice daily. Metronidazole, 400 milligram 3 times daily. And doxycycline, 1 tablet twice daily for 14 days. And I believe that this treatment is likely to have a higher response rate and a lesser chance of having a resistance to the drugs. This one I have been using for the last 16 to 18 months, ever since the colloidal bismuth was available in India. Earlier it was available as Denol, in 1980s. It was marketed by Raptacos and Brett. And then we have been using this
But
drug.
Elder Pharmaceuticals, sir.
Elder
You know,
Pharma.
yeah, Raptacos and Brett is that this thing.
Trimo.
Trimo, yeah, Trimo and the Denol. But the Trimo and Denol went out of the market in 1990s. Until 2018, we did not have anything about colloidal bismuth. So my treatment regimens today is 90% of the people I use the 4 drugs to start with. I don't experiment with the 3 drugs and see whether they are responding or whether they get eradicated, because the testing for eradication is always difficult. We don't have the breath tests which are available widely. We can do the stool antigen and try to see whether the antigen has disappeared. There also it is not widely available. So for me, I think the best regimen will be a quadruple regimen.
What is the compliance rate with your regime? Do they really compliant 14 days?
Yeah, 14 days of the colloidal bismuth and all the 2 like metronidazole, doxycycline and omeprazole, I get a compliance rate of anything between 95 to 97%. I think they may have a little nausea or an abdominal discomfort, but does not prevent them from stopping the drug.
Maybe I should ask Anil what kind of drugs he uses in majority of his patients.
Yeah. See, we typically use a combination of the triple therapy, which includes PPI, amoxicillin, and clarithromycin. Somehow, to be honest, to give you a true data as to what is the compliance, what is the success rate, what is the eradication, there are so many caveats, because a majority of the patient would come to you just for endoscopy. They will strictly not follow the instructions of stopping antibiotics at least for 4 weeks, stopping PPIs at least for 2 weeks before again a retest to know whether it has been eradicated or not. Again, coming back to the same question, because majority of these patients do have functional dyspepsia. We are not ourselves sure whether this therapy was indicated. We are just, because it was positive, somebody has referred, patient has functional dyspepsia, there is no other explanation for the problem, you just do it. So I think most of us in North Delhi do not, keep chasing it for eradication, because the reason and the basic requirement for retesting is pretty strict. A person with a functional dyspepsia would not like to discontinue PPI for 2 weeks or stop antibiotics. How do you ensure that he has stopped antibiotics for 4 weeks? So these are the caveats, and hence, honestly, we do not have good data. But as a rule, we use a combination of clarithromycin, amoxicillin, and PPI. We have never used bismuth because I have not seen a resistant H. pylori in our setting.
Anil, I could see an attitude like Trump where you are very, very clear. But do you also think IgA antibody titer would be a good marker for you to say treatment response, which was high and coming down to low?
Yeah, you see, if you look at the antibody titers, most of the kit which is available from Dr. Lal's lab, it looks for IgG antibodies. And recommendations are, unless there is a 2-fold reduction in the titer, 30 days after eradication, you are not sure whether it is related to that. In fact, in my own practice, I'd never get it done. Because most of the time you are doing it, you want to rule out an ulcer, you will have an RU2 to bank upon. To diagnose H. pylori infection in clinical setting in Indian scenario, I think you have to find very rare indications when you are banking on nothing else but serology to look for either presence of H. pylori or eradication.
Palaniswamy was saying something.
I totally agree with Dr. Anil. I also follow the same triple drug regime, but the compliance even with triple drug regime is sometimes difficult. And to check for the clearance of the H. pylori, again to tell them to stop the PPI is very difficult. I think some of them may not be able to stop it.
Coimbatore is a very rich place with people like Mohan. What is your regime, Mohan? So what do you treat?
Yeah, actually, I started testing for the rapid urease test for H. pylori. I used to import from Delta West, Australia in 1990 to 91. Then at that time I started looking for 2 things I need to confess. One, I feel that the prevalence of H. pylori is becoming lesser as probably over 3 decades, because previously when I used to do endoscopies, at least 5 to 7 of them out of 10 used to be positive. Now we get only 1 or 2 out of 10 become positive. So the CLO test was the one which we started. Then we started home brewing our own rapid URS test and we started using it. Now, I used to use, like this triple regimen for 2 weeks from 92 onwards. But 94, when I went to Guido Tidgut's unit in Amsterdam Academic Medical Center, he was a big proponent of bismuth. So when I came back home, I started using the bismuth quadruple. So I found that the compliance was better because instead of giving 2 weeks double antibiotic, combined bismuth give 2 weeks, just 1 week of double antibiotic with the double dose PP and bismuth. People, the compliance was much better. So 90% of my patients could comply. Those who could not take it also, came back to me and said that they are unable to tolerate this drug or whatever. Then I could substitute. So until from that day, 1994 till today, I'm using bismuth quadruple. And unfortunately, I didn't know KT Shenoy sir couldn't get bismuth. Raptacos Brett at some point of time was manufacturing bismuth only for me. They used to say, you're the only guy in India using it, so we are making it for you. So I said, without a short supply, it should come. So except for 1 or 2 months when we went out of, bismuth, all the rest of the time I got bismuth. So 94 to 2020, I'm using bismuth quadruple, but I'm using only 1 week. Today we have a recommendation that to prevent recurrences, you can go on to, instead of 14 days, you can take 10-day course of bismuth quadruple.
What is the status of quinolones? Lot talked about single dose levofloxacin and things.
Now so much of resistance is coming up now, sir. In fact, 3 decades back, Philip Abrahams's group published on metronidazole, 100% of the bacteria in Mumbai were resistant. Because I was also part of the 2 panels which he organized, and we published in ISG also. We had a 2-day deliberation each time, and I think in 94 and 99, if I remember right, both H. pylori panels, we went through everything, very meticulously. So, and today, that even though metronidazole is, if it gets incorporated along with other drugs, then that resistance gets broken. We have new articles that say that. So probably that is how Dr. KT Shenoy's incorporation of metronidazole works. But nevertheless, now levofloxacin, resistance is going up all over Europe. So, and the drug, I don't like the quinolones much, sir. Especially in the elderly, I'm scared of quinolones. I don't use that. Like they get secreted in saliva, coat the tongue. There is metallic taste. Patients, the non-compliant guys are guys who take clarithromycin or quinolones. They tend to drop out halfway through. So, I don't like quinolones per se. I don't use.
Dr. Setu, we are talking of a disease which is prevalent in 60 to 80% of a population of 1.33 billion.
Okay.
Still, we keep discussing the data of 400 patients published by Japan, 500 from Eastern countries. Why is it that we are not able to have our own culture sensitivity? Maybe I'd like to have Dr. Phillips' comments. See, for 400 cases from a different country we're discussing, we don't have any data of our own. And recent publication from Dr. Carr's group from New Delhi showed that about 60% of the patients were resistant to clarithromycin, 80% were resistant to metronidazole. The reason is most of these antibiotics are frequently used in day-to-day practice. Look at the metronidazole. It will be used left and right by all pelvic infection, all dental infection, all parasitic infection, all diarrhea, irrespective of the etiology. So you're bound to have resistance. So we need to have agency which controls the sale of this drug rather than being freely available off the counter. So unless we're able to do that, we'll be just, swaying around all these antibiotics with our own data. Now there is new molecular technology which is available. Now you can do a PCR. It's just like GeneXpert for tuberculosis. You can look at the H. pylori in the stool or in the tissue specimen which you are obtaining, and then look at the sensitivity of different antibiotics depending on the genetic analysis. You can have next generation sequencing, you can have whole genome sequencing. That may be the answer. Till then, we'll keep swaying one way or the other depending on who publishes. Dr. Phillips comments on that.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to put all this in order. I mean, put it all in perspective because we've got such wonderful opinions from everyone. Just for the audience, we have different treatment regimens, starting with the standard triple, the bismuth quadruple, concomitant, which is again 4 drugs but without bismuth, sequential therapy, and hybrid therapy. Now, sequential and hybrid have had their day in the sun, but they probably haven't taken off in the same way as the others have. Now, if you look at the Maastricht 5 recommendation, the Florence recommendation, in countries where there is a more than 15% clarithromycin resistance, whether to use bismuth or non-bismuth quadruple depends on whether you have metronidazole resistance or you don't have it. So where you have countries with clarithromycin and metro resistance, as we say we have in India, then the recommendation is to use bismuth quadruple. If we have only clarithrol and low metro resistance, then we can use non-bismuth concomitant therapy. This is what Maastricht says. Now, unfortunately, in India, data, like Anil said, in a country so big, we are still dealing with numbers that are very small as compared to our huge population. So what we are talking about, clarithromycin resistance and amoxicillin resistance and all that, is only based on small numbers. And figures vary. Although we reported 100% metronidazole resistance 20 years or 25 years ago, numbers have varied anywhere from 40 to 100% from different parts of the country. Having said all this theory, we recently had a study, and also I must clarify that Maastricht says that in such countries, you should extend the treatment to 14 days, unless there is existing evidence that 10 days will work. So one of my DNB students, in fact, just last year completed a study where he compared concomitant therapy with sequential therapy. And this concomitant therapy, of course, used metronidazole, or rather we used tinidazole, clarithromycin, and amoxicillin, and found that simple concomitant therapy gives a per protocol eradication rate of 93%. And simple sequential therapy with PPI and amoxicillin and followed by the sequence, there again we had close to 90%, 90% response rate at 10 days. So although we talk about in vitro high resistance rates, the fact is that there are pockets in the country where even triple therapy, not triple therapy so much, as non-bismuth quadruple therapy and sequential therapy also give eradication rates as high as 90%. So the caveat here is in vitro resistance may not necessarily translate to in vivo resistance. So concomitant non-bismuth may work in our country even now, and given for 10 days also may work, although the recommendation is in our country it should be, like Katie Shenoy said, bismuth quadruple. Bismuth is now available, of course. But we still continue to use concomitant without bismuth. That means 4 drugs without bismuth. PPI, amoxicillin, clarithromycin, tinidazole given for 10 days, and it still gives us 90% response. This is data just published a few months ago.
Obviously, sorry, you mean quinolones has no place?
Yeah, we are a little hesitant about using quinolones only because those drugs are also used in TB.
Mohan, yes.
Sir, I read somewhere that I always believe the H. pylori, one drug which does not have any resistance is amoxicillin. Now we say there are articles which say in vitro resistance in 27% to 30%. So again, as you said, in vitro doesn't translate into in vivo, especially when you go in combination. I think probably this is broken.
So obviously we have involuntary prescription of the so-called kits where you take 3 in the morning and 3 in the evening. Still remains standard of practice. But do any one of us look for eradication? Do we call after 14 days and do an RUT and a biopsy? Do we do that? And do we recommend?
We do, because we have the urea breath test. So we do it routinely.
That seems to be very sensitive. So what was your, so you don't have to do sensitivity test, but then you can do urea breath and say, here you are cleared.
Yeah, and 90% did clear in our study with concomitant therapy. 4-drug concomitant, non-bismuth.
I also call them back, but after 30 days, sir. And again, when you're doing a urea breath test, the caveat is at least for 2 weeks, the patient should be off PPIs. So what I do is after eradication of H. pylori, I continue PPI for at least for 1 month. And until the acidity levels come down, the patient's symptoms improve and he becomes better. Then I put him on ranitidine for 2 weeks and then call him for a urea breath test just to confirm that it has been eradicated.
On Prasad regimen.
No, but I think why do you want to give ranitidine for them of all the things?
No, because sir, but I cannot continue pantoprazole if he is symptomatic. Then it's a problem, sir, because he himself will start taking PPI, because you can get it across the counter OTC. You can get proton pump inhibitor. If he's symptomatic, he'll start. Then my urea breath test will become negative. Falsely, it may become negative.
So Mohan, you know what you're saying now, that after eradicating H. pylori, it is the PPI that gives response. So we're going full circle back to then, why did we eradicate H. pylori?
But I remember one data where PPI itself is directly anti-H. pylori because it blocks a similar pump of the H. pylori.
Yes, small part of it. Mainly it increases the pH level and makes the organism replicative, which makes them more susceptible to antibiotics.
So any day
you have to have a PPI.
Sir, can I respond to Philip sir's comment about using PPI after eradication of H. pylori? See, what happens is I think you would recall Bardhan's study from UK along with Canadian Gastroenterology Association. The beautiful study designed for 1 year where they took people with peptic ulcer disease and with H. pylori positive, negative, and then treated and followed up. They said on a monthly basis, those people were checked for their acid levels. Sir. It was a phenomenal study. I don't think anywhere it can be replicated. So they found that for the acid levels to come down, it took almost 6 to 12 months. So patients, even if you give 1 week or 2 weeks course against H. pylori, all of them do not become asymptomatic. The symptoms continue for some time. So many of these studies are truncated at 4 weeks or 8 weeks. And so they don't follow up these patients, and that is why we don't know. But most of the patients will remain symptomatic even after 1 or 2 weeks. So I always continue PPIs, but then step it down and take them off after 1 month. Say if there are no symptoms, nothing needs to be done. After 2 weeks after stopping the PPI, then I call them for UBT, because UBT can be falsely positive on somebody who's taking PPI. Say if you're symptomatic, then take ranitidine for a couple of weeks. 150 milligram BD at a small dose, or sucralfate or antacids on demand can also be done. So I leave the choice to them.
One, I'm sure you meant falsely negative, isn't it, while on PPI? You can get a false negative.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. False negative, sorry. While on PPI, UBT can become falsely negative.
Yeah.
Dr. Setu, one of the mechanisms by which PPIs are essential in treatment of H. pylori is that PPIs by default will lead to decrease in the acid production, thereby increasing the gastric pH. For any antibiotics to be effective in the gastric juice, by default, most of the drugs will pass into the small bowel to be absorbed into the circulation. But here is a therapy in which you want highest concentration of the drug in the gastric juice. So if you are able to raise the pH of the stomach by giving PPI, that is one of the important mechanisms. Why do you have high concentration of the drugs which act against H. pylori? That is one of the reasons why PPI is an essential component of anti-H. pylori therapy.
And what is your comment on reinfection? Because we are talking very less in an endemic country. But what is our knowledge about reinfection?
As I said, Dr. Setu, again, the caveat is how many of us sincerely and honestly document the eradication in the first instance? Unless you have a good follow-up study of long-term, follow-up of those who have been treated, how do you know the first has been infected? In fact, there are centers in India in which the endoscopy has prevalence is so high and so ubiquitous and universal that it is printed on their endoscopy report that H. pylori taken and biopsy positive. Because you hardly see any patient who is negative, or you are talking and doing it on patient who are symptomatic. So unless you do a good, honest, long-term study of seeing with all the caveats of discontinuing antibiotic, stopping all the drugs and taking all due precautions with standard documented kits, I think the reinfection data, I'm yet to study a good study, I'm yet to see a good study being published from India which can answer. Short of that, I think we will have to follow what comes good from the countries like Japan and South Asia.
If I may add something to that.
Yes, sir. Please feel free.
Yeah. I mean, this is almost like patting yourself on the back, but to my knowledge, the only information that we have, like Anil mentioned, is an article from the late 1990s, which we did at the KM Hospital, where we looked at reinfection rate in those who had eradication and fresh infections in those who did not have the organisms. And we had 50 patients in each group, 50 persons in each group. And our total reinfection rate at the end of 1 year was less than 2%. So while we say it's a high prevalence country, the risk is high, reinfection rate is high, we have only one complete study published in IJG, Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, 1995, I think it was, or close to 2000, where less than 2% was the reinfection rate or fresh infection rate at 1 year. Unfortunately, like Anil so rightly said, there's no one who's doing this on a regular basis. So we don't have reinfection rates coming from anywhere else. One of my students now is doing that 20 years later.
If we can reduplicate that data, sir, I think that will make a very good point of treating, just testing and treating everybody, including stool antigen.
Yeah.
You have an organism which can be eradicated. It has so many complications. We can have repetition of what Dr. Phillips has published. I think that will be a good contribution to knowledge and the natural history of H. pylori in India. We sincerely look forward to that.
Yeah, one question I have is, how do we actually read the RUT? Is it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or is there any like delayed one? Does it mean anything? I mean, what is our experience? Because normally we wait for about 5 to 7 minutes. The same patient, we'll ask them to wait outside, and suddenly the slide is kept on the endoscopy report and said, see, it is such a pink color, so you are positive. What exactly we do?
Yeah, you see,
It's a question asked by audience.
Yeah, it will all depend upon the concentration of the bacilli at Helicobacter pylori organism and the quantum of urea it is producing. At times, what happens is you finish the endoscopy, especially in a patient with a frank ulcer. You do an endoscopy, tell the guy this is a yellow strip, it may turn pink. By the time you get back to your office after finishing endoscopy, waiting for the endoscopy, second endoscopy to be ready, it is already pink. You're not able to show him that it was yellow to begin with. So it all depends on the quantum of the infection. And then there are other caveats, as I said, most of the patients who will come to you with ulcer would already be on PPIs. So maybe by default, the concentration of the H. pylori will be less. It will take more time. But typically, I think we wait 48 hours and to see the change in the color. The higher the concentration, more the number of bacilli, the faster will be the changeover of color.
Actually, also the writer is, as Anil was pointing out earlier, also just a single antral biopsy will not help. So usually, like what is recommended originally is 5 centimeter from the pylorus, that is a distal antrum, another bit from the proximal antrum or distal body, and then a proximal body all along the greater curvature. Because why? Because the lesser curvature, atrophic gastritis can happen where the population of H. pylori will be low. Again, if you are taking biopsy from inflamed areas, reddish areas, you may not get H. pylori. You have to take from the biopsy has to be taken from the non-inflamed areas. So all these caveats are there. So that is why, and depending on the population of bacterial load that the patient has, as Anil pointed out, if it is high, immediately it turns positive. Otherwise, it's a delayed positivity. Many units hand over the clot test strip to the patient himself and to tell them to call in the evening if it becomes positive, if the yellow becomes red. Sometimes what happens after it becoming red, again after a few, 1 day or so, it becomes yellow again. So if somebody is bringing the strip, at the time of endoscopy it was red, now it is yellow, that happens automatically, it can change color like that. I've seen that.
Dr. Vijay, you don't need to have a relook at the faded color. You already have won the battle by showing that you have won the battle by showing him a pink spot. Then you don't really have a relook at it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And another thing, Dr. Setu, is that once you have a peptic ulcer, I think it is a most definite indication for treating H. pylori. Whether there is H. pylori or not, you have to treat it. So it doesn't give you a big, a stimulus to go and keep on checking it and repeating it, presuming that whatever therapy you have is effective enough. So all patients with peptic ulcer bleeding will be by default put on anti-H. pylori therapy, whether the H. pylori is positive or not.
Do we agree? I don't know. I don't do that.
Dr. Setu,
others?
Sir, please tell me, sir. Sir, please feel free to tell me.
Dr. Setu,
Yes,
I
sir.
think we have been
Sir.
discussing about the rapid urease test. And
Yes, sir,
when
please.
see, if you look at 1980s, the rapid urease test used to be done in the form of a test tube with the urea solution,
Yes.
10% weight by volume, with phenol red as the indicator. And this test was available to us in our own laboratory. Arvind from Malya Hospital, I think, has called this as the rapid urease test using the tube. But now that we have got the slide as well as the BioHeat, we have been doing both the tests. The slide which is available from Calcutta and the BioHeat which is available from the company from Helsinki. The BioHeat has a lesser percentage of positivity compared to the slide test. See, most of us use the slide, and the slide test will be positive, say, in about 35 to 40%. But the same sample or the same site as the H. pylori taken and use the BioHeat, which is a tube with 1% 1 ml of solution to be put in, the positivity rate is only about 10 to 15%. And the reading is anywhere between 2 minutes to 30 minutes. As Anil mentioned, the number of bacteria, the larger number of bacteria, it turns to be pink very quickly, but the smaller number of bacteria, it turns about 30 minutes. But anything which becomes positive at the end of the day, I don't know whether we can call it as a test positive. I think the 30 minutes will be a reasonable good time to say that the test is positive or negative. So 2 minutes to 30 minutes will be the time in which the test can be reported.
Anil, Anil,
Yeah.
do you say that we wait for 30 minutes to say positive or negative? Positive, early pink as bacterial load can say, but 30 minutes, is it a cutoff point? Because there were a couple of questions.
You see, I think you cannot be again stringent about the timing of 30 minutes unless you have ideal conditions which have been preordained, as mentioned by Dr. Shinoy. That is the type of tube versus card test, authenticity of the card test, and the validity of these tests. So usually, and in any case, to be honest, our decision of treatment does not depend on positivity or negativity alone. We have extraneous constraints. We have our own judgment. You see, if I believe that 30% of the patients with functional dyspepsia will respond to H. pylori therapy, if the patient has nothing else, I like to treat him whether there is H. pylori or not. So those constraints also become important. So I'll wait for another day or so, and I don't need to be strictly looking to be having a positive test after 35. If it is positive after 35 minutes, I'll not take it as a negative.
I think, sorry. Yes, sir. Please come.
Can I make
please.
a point?
Sir. Yeah, please, sir.
Ideally, we take cloth from various manufacturers, and ideally that statement should be read it as per the manufacturer guidelines.
Yes.
The fact is, there is no manufacturer guidelines for the commercial strips.
Agreed.
Number one. So we do it whenever we feel like. Number two, among the commercial strips, and I don't want to mention the manufacturer, in a batch of 50 strips that you get, you use it maybe over 1 month or 2 months, and ultimately when you come to the last part, some of them have already turned red. Lying in the carton, not used for endoscopy. By the time you take it, it's already red, which means the quality of commercial flow test in India is unsupervised. There's no quality control. Okay. Having said that, then it's up to us to decide when you should do the reading. And quite often, I tell the patient, as long as you're here 2 hours, if it turns positive, it is positive. Beyond that, the specificity keeps going down. And then he tells me, but look, your sister, your nurse on duty said, call me back after 24 hours. So the fact is that none of us knows the final answer, but all we can say is that the earlier it turns positive, the more likely it is H. pylori. The later it turns positive, the more likely it is non-specific. Now coming to liquid versus agar, in fact, we got so frustrated with the whole system that now we're making our own urea agar. I mean what's it called?
Solution.
The RUT.
Urea solution.
Yeah, now solution versus agar. That again is another issue. We tested this again in the late 90s and early 2000s. Solution has more diffusion. So it takes a little longer, which must be why we get a lower positivity rate. It takes a little longer for the entire solution to turn color. Whereas agar will turn where you put the tissue in it because it's agar. Also, Anil mentioned that the higher the concentration of bacteria, more likely to get positive. There is another side to it also, which we don't follow. The higher the urea concentration, more likely to be positive. So the standard strip is 2% or so, they say, the manufacturers. If you take it up to 10%, you'll get a higher positivity rate. So when do you say that this is specific, this is sensitive? I don't think we have the final answer. So practically the best thing to do would be to make your own in-house agar urea test. Get it standardized if you can and state 2 hours, 4 hours, but I would not go beyond 4 hours to state that if it turns positive the next morning, come back to us. I wouldn't say that because we lose a lot on specificity, although we gain on sensitivity.
As Professor Philip pointed out, we have been homebrewing our own rapid urease test. So we prepare alternate days. We prepare urea freshly prepared urea solution with either phenol red or bromothymol blue. Those days also used to use, and we used to wait for almost 6 to 8 hours. Usually we don't we discard it by the evening, so we don't wait beyond. So and again, if you are homebrewing it, the test tubes when you are reusing, you have to give a potassium dichromate wash. If potassium dichromate wash is not given, so we always have a control, positive control, where we can put the harsh radish, then it turns color. So just as a positive control. Then you have a negative control, which is made by the lab, which is kept there, which should not turn color. It should not turn pink automatically, as Professor Philip was pointing out. That means that the wash has been done properly when you are reusing these test tubes. For people who are using test tubes, I think the point is well taken from all of you that if you do it probably, you cannot wait beyond 6 hours or so, or 8 hours maybe.
No, I think Philip and Mohan brought in a very important, homemaking solution. Is it not comparable to the so-called Clo test available in the market? Because
we tested, sir. We ran 100 samples in my center and also in Philip Augustine's PVS Memorial Hospital. I'm talking about 2 decades back. We tested against 100 test strips of Clo test and 100 test strips he had imported from Middle East. I don't remember the name. He ran in-house also, they homebrewed and compared. We found that 95% concordance. Then that is what
I think Mohan, I could see the satire which was thrown by Anil that we are all talking only data of once again Philip's data, Dr. Shobana, whom I'm missing today, their data. I think we should give our PG students again back to this particular subject so that we would be more 100 years. Here madam is. Madam, we have 3 questions which has been bothering us, and we want probably the final jury. I think Madam Jury is here. Should we test every patient who comes to the hospital with dyspepsia, do an endoscopy biopsy for H. pylori?
The jury was out and now the jury is back. I think.
So what was your suggestion
Dr. Katie Shenoy was very clear, and while Dr. Philip is little balanced, he says that every patient who comes with dyspepsia, if it is, you should test and then probably treat rather than treat without testing.
Yeah. So I would go with that. The only thing I would like to say is that there's recent data to show that the incidence of cancer may be rising, gastric cancer. We don't have definite data, but there are some incidences. So if you're doing an endoscopy and the antrum is right in front of you, there's no harm in taking a biopsy. But if the patient has been on PPI, take 2 or 3 biopsies. You can take it in the same well for RUT, and that should be fine.
Now we are coming back to one very important issue, you being expert, and particularly I have great regard to you and Philips because when we attended in the 94-96 the H. pylori pivotal meetings, but once you detect positive, you feel like treating, or do you say no, your endoscopy is normal, you are HP positive, you don't need treatment? What is your guideline?
So the guidelines for patients with duodenal ulcer, family history of gastric cancer remain. In the rest of them, I would take it as a case-by-case basis. Now, Rome Foundation has created a big confusion. I'm sure that's been addressed earlier. Discussed. So,
Yes.
if you don't treat and you want to do research with the Rome Foundation, you're stuck.
Okay.
So you will say that the patient is H. pylori positive, doesn't require treatment. The dyspepsia is not going away, but you can't call it functional dyspepsia unless the H. pylori is treated. So it is the chicken and egg story. You don't know where it starts and where it ends. So
we also made a. Yeah, please. Sorry, ma'am.
No, carry on. You were saying something.
Sorry, we also made a point that we just treat and don't bother to look at eradication. What is your opinion? Do we check or don't do anything?
So if we have a patient with peptic ulcer, bleed, diagnosed peptic ulcer, check for eradication. And in that setting, putting the patient off PPI if there is a peptic ulcer is difficult. And doing an endoscopy is even more difficult because it adds to the cost. At this moment, non-invasive tests may be useful, like hydrogen breath test, so that might be better. Urea breath test, a urea breath test or a fecal antigen, that may be important.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Philip was talking about one of his referral studies about using urea breath, which is very, very sensitive and for eradication and all. Mohan, I just wanted to tickle you. You seem to be reading so much. Does endoscopes transmit H. pylori?
Sorry, sir?
Do
endoscopes transmit H. pylori?
Yes.
It's quite possible. As long as we do a proper sterilization of endoscopes, you can definitely transmit any bacteria or any virus. Anything is transmissible. Even the biopsy forceps also can transmit H. pylori because some units I've seen they have only 1 or 2 biopsy forceps. They are doing 10 endoscopies. Even sometimes gastric cancer patient they have biopsied and the next patient they do a biopsy. That small portion is sticking on and then it comes as positive. I've had situation like that where people have done biopsy. What I tell is like we tell the practitioners if you are giving 50 injections, have 50 syringes and needles. When those days before reusable, now it's all disposable. Like that, now if you're using 10 biopsies, have 10 biopsy forceps. Let it not come back to you and it has to be vigorously cleaned if you're reusing it. So again, even the biopsy forceps can transmit. So all the channels can transmit unless otherwise we are really sure enough to clean it.
I wanted to ask Madam Shobana because this has been discussed from the last 80 minutes, which we have been, and I'm very happy to announce that we have almost around 1600 audience who have been logged in, which is really good. Madam Shobana, what is your regime that you would say in your experience could be a good model for our country? Or for me, for example, if I come to you?
I don't think you'll come to me. That's a different point. But I think if it is a first-time treatment, 2 antibiotics and a PPI, I'm not sure that the metronidazole really works in these settings because the resistance to metronidazole and its analogs, that is the other imidazoles, is almost universal. So I would say that we can go by culture studies and check our population from time to time. But right now, I think there's a lot of metronidazole resistance. So 2 antibiotics and a PPI. Alternatively, if the patient has come a second time, the failure of H. pylori eradication, and it's a critical case like duodenal ulcer, bleed, I would add bismuth.
Yeah, I thought I'll bring down points. Professor Palaniswamy has in the beginning said that he would like to check up those specific cohorts who have family history of malignancy. And Katie Shenoy was very, very clear about this RUT business and timing of the test. Professor Abraham was referring to several of his studies and probably the reinfection which we never look at. Mohan seems to have well read and he was quoting several studies and he was very clear that he would follow 3-drug regime, whereas Katie Shenoy was considering bismuth as his priority. Dr. Anil seems to be a little bit satirical about, I think he gives a pathway to some teachers like us that we should redo the H. pylori studies with the new postgraduates who are likely to come. And maybe we should do, Madam Shobna should now consider doing a multicentric kind of study. At least what is the prevalence we can redo. Because we have not done reprevalence studies of hepatitis B after a massive vaccination. That map remains the same. I think I would probably request, and we could all be part of that particular wonderful study with our new PGs coming. What would be the HP prevalence by a couple of standard tests, maybe RUT plus histology or even antibodies in some people, I think, or antibody prevalence in the community. I think we could take 3-4 topics and get ourselves knowledged. I think I must thank you. We have spent literally about 80 minutes on this particular area, and we still have several questions unanswered, which only shows that we know about the bacteria very well, but our innocence, I won't say ignorance, still remains at large. Can I request the Zydus group to come in and then thank Chayan? You would like to come?
Sir, Chayan would.
Yeah. Nanda, please request Chayan to log in.
Chayan would.
Yes, sir. I'm here. Yeah.
So, before we hand over, can I just make one quick point?
No, sir, you please. There's a lot of time. I mean, I only just said this can go on forever. But
of course it can. Yes.
Please, sir. Please.
Yes, sir. In fact, extending what was already said, I think we should now accept that a 4-drug regimen is what we should recommend for this country, concomitant with or without bismuth. Yeah, because unless we have better sensitivity rate coming up in future, a dual therapy is of course out. Triple therapy also will have to be kept aside for now. Quadruple therapy with or without bismuth, concomitant therapy is what we need. 10 days or 14 days. We may some happy day go back to 10 day. To triple drug. The second point about endoscopes transmitting it, like Mohan said, of course, endoscope can transmit anything. But if we do a good machine wash after a thorough biologic cleaning, we should not be doing that. Coming to the biopsy forceps, one of my previous residents also, who's now a consultant, had done an interview study with people coming for endoscopy and asked them, this is of course corporate hospital, charges are high, ask them, will you accept if this is the cost difference between a reusable biopsy forceps, where you take maybe divide the cost of one forceps by 10, or a fresh forceps for you and the cost is so many hundreds, what would you prefer? Almost universally, all of them said, I would rather have a disposable forceps. So we can factor that into our endoscopy practice if you're worried about transmission. All of them. Of course, I'm not saying this about public hospitals, but in the corporate sector where people are aware that their money can buy things, most of them would prefer to have a disposable biopsy forceps at a reasonable cost, few hundreds.
Dr. Philip, we are using a disposable biopsy forceps. When you buy in bulk, you get for a cheaper price.
Yes, of course. At that time, it was 700 rupees per forceps.
We do the same thing, but we are using disposable biopsy forceps and disposable bite cards.
Yeah,
but I see that the company people get it back and destroy it, because otherwise we are producing junk, so much of junk to be disposed. So they made them promise that they'll destroy it at the end of the take it and recycle.
Yeah.
I think I remember when you said about disposable thing, there was a very big VIP who got colonoscopy done in Mumbai and he left the scope. He purchased and left the scope. I wish we had more people like that. Okay, Chayan. No, he's not philanthropist. He's a big film actor. Chayan, please come.
Yeah, sure, sir. Sure. Good evening, doctor. On behalf of us, Chayan Majumdar, deemed as an honor to deliver the vote of thanks to those who have contributed to make this event, Encountered with Expert, a grand success. At the outset, we'd like to thank Dr. Sethu Babu for conceptualizing this entire event and helping us to bring together the experts who are world-acclaimed clinicians and legends in the field of gastroenterology. Our heartfelt thanks to all our expert panelists. It has been our privilege to have you all, Dr. Anil Arora, Dr. K.R. Palaniswamy, Dr. K.T. Shinal, Dr. Philip Avraham, Dr. Shobna Bhatia, and Dr. V.G. Mohan Prasad. We are sure today's panel discussion will help all participating clinicians in their day-to-day practice. A big thank you to all participants, without whom the event would not have been possible. Thank you very much for your valuable time. We believe that there is a need for such encounter in future too, where practice-related challenges will be addressed. We'll continue to rely on your affection and support now and hereafter. Good night and have a great weekend. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.